So let's review where we are. First off, we spent some time in part one building this and adding some detail and whatnot. In part two, we showed you kind of the finished product and then proceeded to move along this segment of the rail where we had some leveling issues and whatnot. I've got that in and have since added a few more details to that section of the rail line. Now, to the big river crossing, a couple changes. Number one, you can see I've completely destroyed my rock wall. While I was happy with experimenting with this at the beginning and using clay to assemble the wall and keep it together, it dries and it's no good. As a cheap filler to fill in some gaps where you have some mistakes or errors, it might be okay, but there's some better things to use, which we'll preview or we'll get to in another episode or whatnot. So I'm going to use some of this rock on both sides, but then shape this terrain to be a little bit more not as rocky, because it was fun, like I said, but needs some different work. Through this whole time, I've been checking, double checking, and rechecking, and checking again the level. Here's the bridge we have planned to go in about mid-span here with the pylon and of course the abutment on the east side. But checking this all the way through as we had before with the level, it also keeps us in line, so make sure I don't inadvertently angle off the track to induce derailments or anything like that. And if you look, we are actually between the bubbles, actually, a good thing. It does require, though, cutting this down just a little bit because it is heavy on the one side, so we'll reduce that height and we should have a good smooth bridge. For the bridge abutments, I've cut pink styrofoam and then shaped it to the appropriate size for the bridge abutment. I've also used joint compound, just like any drywall joint compound, on here, a couple layers sanded, a couple layers sanded, and whatnot, to kind of give it some consistency to concrete. This will also protect the pink styrofoam from paint. Earlier I had tried using spray paint on one of these, and I completely disintegrated the piece of styrofoam. So lesson learned there. I've also moved on and done the same thing to our center pier. Again, there's some cutting and experimenting with getting this just right, and truth be told, I'm not too concerned about the backside of being completely symmetrical. It's very hard to do, at least it's hard for me to do just by hand. Again, I've added the joint compound. You can see it's very rough. We'll sand that off to give our pier appearance as we get ready to put in these bridges, which we've seen before. The other thing you might have noticed here on this side of our crossing is I used to have that wood platform to build out some of the slope and whatnot. However, with the dual bridges that we got, I ended up taking it out, and I think it'll be a little bit better as we assemble this thing to its final completion. But that's all right. I used the plywood somewhere else, and that's part of it, right? It's all good. It's fun, and just kind of experimenting what works. I like the rock wall on the other side is part of why this is enjoyable. Sometimes it would get a little smelly in the basement, so I rigged up this hokey paint booth, some styrofoam and paper or whatnot, hopefully to contain some of that. And I have it next to the window, which I'll crack when I begin airbrushing. We'll see how that works. So a little bit of a story about this airbrush is this is a airbrush. It's Badger airbrush, good old classic. I've had for well over 35 years at least. And set it aside when I started building the Old Dutch Road, and am now ready to use it. And I discovered that I couldn't find the stupid little glass jar that the actual paint goes in. So after searching around quite a bit, I finally gave up, went to the hobby store, and they were able to come up with a very simple solution. It'll work perfectly. I got a couple of those. The other thing they did is remind me that the seal in here had probably dried up, and indeed it was in pretty rough shape. So they had Badger replacement parts, and I got a seal for in there, so we'll see how this works. Just got started, and I just tried a little bit of paint, and I'm already out, it appears. But the good news is the old airbrush is working just fine. So now that our bridges have dried, they're still a bit tacky. I wanted to add a little bit of, corrosion effect on the aluminum bridges, so I just mixed up some dark brown paint on an old toothbrush. I'm not using, and just doing the little splatter effect just to put a few bits of brown on there. So it looks like it's starting to, corrode in different places, which would do normally if you look at bridges that haven't been freshly painted. You do see they're kind of splotchy with some dark brown or maybe even black, kind of pockets of rust, if you will. So I'm pretty happy with that. It's just subtle enough to where it's not overbearing, but gives it a little more detail, a little more character or whatnot. So I'm going to do that on both segments, and I think we'll be in good shape. Okay, so a little bit earlier today, we added a bit more of the splatter of rust onto each of the bridges to show how it begins to get corroded. And that's not looking too bad, but we also wanted to add a little bit of rust. So after some trouble with the airbrush this morning, I think we're running. Here's my test. So the idea here is rust up the surfaces that would collect water, so like snow or ice that's on the tops. We're going to try that and see if we can get away without covering up the whole bridge. I got excited, obviously, put these together, so we'll see what we can do. It'll look just fine. The last thing we did on the truss bridge was cut 2 pieces of rail out of 2 junk pieces of track and use those to make the 2 segments into one. The other thing which you won't see here is we stained and added a small piece of wood trim on each side of the rails just to give it more detail. We'll look at that later. Last weekend was the 2025 Mad City Model Railroad Show. I took that in, and it's one of the reasons I'm a little bit late with my next video. That and hosting a Super Bowl party the weekend before, but it's all good. A lot of video and imagery out there on the web for the show. Hopefully you can go next time if you've never been there. It's a great event.